Blah, 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 blah. All right, hello everyone. Welcome to Roc Game Dev. Cool. So welcome to the workshop. My name is Sam. For anyone who doesn't know me, I am the Roc Game Dev workshop coordinator. So I make sure that we have people to come in and talk with you guys on the last Wednesday of every month. So in case you've never been to Roc Game Dev before, I apologize for all of the other sound that's going to happen in the in the atrium here. But Roc Game Dev is a nonprofit organization that brings together community members, students, and hobbyists from around Rochester to talk about game design development. So we host workshops here on the last Wednesday of every month, as well as other events here and in our Sibley space downtown. Our next event, in case you're looking to come to more events, is next week on Wednesday, 7 p.m. right here. That is our RIT meetup where you can come show off your projects, get feedback, do some networking, and pizza and drinks will be provided just like they are tonight. For a full list of events and other Roc Game Dev info, check out our website, rocgamedev.com, and our Facebook page, as well as our Discord and our Twitter. So some announcements before we dive into our workshop tonight. November's workshop will be November 20th, not the last Wednesday like it normally is because of the Thanksgiving holidays. A lot of people will be busy or out of town, so we've moved it up a week. And that workshop will be Mike Shug talking about project anti-patterns. There is also, again, the RIT meetup here from 7 to 9 next week. You can sign up now for the RMSC showcase. That'll be happening on November 9th from 11 to 3. We have a limit of 10 exhibitors, so these slides will be posted. Jump on that ASAP if you are interested. There's also the Magic Community Incubator and Magic Makers applications due. More information can be found at those links, and both applications are due Friday at noon. Additionally, the Roc Maker Fair will be happening November 23rd. Please feel free to buy tickets if you aren't already signed up. If you are looking to be a maker, they are still accepting applications, but they are accepted on a case-by-case basis. Otherwise, come check out the community. There will be games and non-games maker activities there. And then last but not least, RIT Game Dev Club will be hosting a game jam here this weekend. It starts at 7 p.m. on Friday. Awesome. So in case you are inspired tonight, you want to host a workshop, or you just have an idea for a workshop that you'd like to see, even if you don't know who would put it on, please feel free to chat with me after the workshop, or you can DM me. I am Sam_Camerata on Discord and Sam_Catamaran on Twitter. I am happy to chat with you about what that would look like. And without further ado, let's talk about tonight's workshop. So John Blau, our community member. Oh, sorry.
One correction real quick on the announcements.
Yeah.
The community incubator applications are due at the end of the day, so like 12 midnight.
Oh.
Yeah, sorry.
No problem. 11:59 p.m.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. So John Blau, he'll be talking about design intent. John Blau is a game designer in his final semester at RIT. He has showcased 2 games, MetroGnome and Elderberry Trails, at expos like GDC, participated twice in Intel's University Games Showcase, and he worked as a virtual reality developer intern for Hasbro and has been a member of the Roc Game Dev community for over 2 years. So if you haven't already gotten some pizza and drinks, please feel free to grab some before we start and strap in for a wonderful talk. That will start in just a couple minutes as we transition into John's slide deck. Welcome to Roc Game Dev, everyone.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. Happy day before Halloween. There will be no spooks in this talk. I thought about putting boo on a slide, but I thought that maybe that wouldn't age well because the talk's gonna be, I guess, recorded. So go play some Grim Fandango. That's an excellent game. And tonight we're talking about design intent. This is really, yeah, I know, Grim Fandango, right? So this is a talk on values and design intent. So just before we get into that super huge, what is this talk? And if we haven't met before, I see a lot of faces that I recognize, but also some that I'm not so familiar with, and I'm happy to see you all. Who am I? Sam gave a wonderful, brief little introduction. I'm a fourth-year student here at RIT. I'm John Blau. It's my last semester, and starting in January, I'll be off working as a game designer, which is pretty cool. I also work over as an RA on dorm side, so some of you know me from that. Here's a quick little highlight reel of some of what I've gotten to work on over the past few years. If you catch me afterwards, I'm happy to talk about any of them at length, because they each taught me really different things. And they were all super important to getting where I am today. So, what is this talk about? Well, I want to give a few disclaimers first. Firstly, in this talk, I'm going to talk from my own experience a lot, and from the experience of others. It's not particularly scientific, and none of this is meant to be the truth. The last thing that I want anybody to do is scribble these in some stones, and then 2,000 years later, somebody finds them and says that they're gospel. This talk is also going to be aimed a little bit more at designers, but I think it has important lessons for anybody who's working in the game space, particularly for independent developers and for people working as members of smaller teams. I think that a lot of design actually transfers between positions a lot and between people, so there's takeaways for everybody. Also, just design intent involves a lot of reflection and a lot of context. And I will probably maybe misrepresent something here. My apologies in advance if I do. And I'm hoping that when I do, you can send me some feedback so that we can make the talk better. And I can correct anything that maybe I misrepresent. Okay, so with all that out of the way, what is design intent? What are we talking about? What do we mean when we use the word intent? So I wanted to get people's a baseline of where most of y'all might be at for the talk. So I asked a few friends those exact questions. What does design intent mean? What is design intent? JV, who's the producer in residence here at Magic, John Veneron, I asked him, and he said that design intent takes two main forms. Firstly, it's the form that sort of helps members of a team coalesce around some idea. It sets out the vision for what a game's going to be, and helps people to rally around some singular ideas. He also said that it sort of asks the question, is the player doing or taking away from our game what we anticipated them to? Elizabeth L., who's also in the audience, sup, I'm not going to call you out, but who worked on Elderberry with me and has also been a very good friend for the whole time, since week 2 here at RIT, says that design intent is all about asking this question: is this thing saying what I want it to say? So is my game saying what I want it to say? Are people getting out of this what I expect them to? All the people that I asked this question to actually frame design intent in a similar way, basically is the player picking up what I'm putting down? And there are some really valid ways, these are some really valid ways to express design intent. I was happy to see that there was some good baseline for it. But I think that there's a sort of implicit question behind each of those definitions, which is the question you're sort of asking yourself, which is, what am I hoping that people take away from my game? It's implicit because you need to know what you're trying to say before you say it. How can you be a conscious and intentional creator if you're not aware of what you're creating? So for me, design intent is all about a set of values that you want to share with others. Those values are what you imbue into the game and what people will walk away with. So the way I try to think about these values, and maybe it's the producer in me a little bit, is like in an agile manifesto sort of way, if you're familiar with that. The agile manifesto is a series of statements and values said from the perspective of software developers who codified their values in order to produce better software with their clients. Basically, they look a little something like this. We value something on the left over something on the right. One of the examples from the Agile Manifesto is the following. We value customer collaboration over contract negotiation, meaning that as developers write code, they want to stress communication, feedback, and active feedback from their clients over going back and forth about what it is that they were trying to build and quabbling over like what language is being used in the documentation. They value directly hearing from the customer over implementing features off of a checklist on a sheet. It's really important to know that in this model, it's not that the things on the right have no value, right? It's that we're valuing the things on the left more. Love you, JV. So that's like a pretty compelling thing, right? But John, this isn't a production talk. Okay, I'll take off that hat, right? And put on the designer hat. We're not talking about production, but we are talking about design intent, which again, for this talk, I'm framing as about values. For example, some examples of how that might work out in terms of games might be we value aggression, right, over tactical gameplay. We value player and NPC relationships over combat, right? That is, you as a team are valuing the thing on the left more than the thing on the right. Whether you realize it or not, this is happening at every single moment in your game, and your players are gonna pick up on it. Let's be conscious creators and make these value judgments really intentionally. In part of this talk, we'll give some practices for defining your game's values, and for most of the rest of it, we'll go over ways that you can make those values, make sure that those values are clearly expressed. Design intent is going to ask the question ultimately, like seek to answer the question, how are those values that we define about our game allowing my players to engage with and interpret my game? Given that, here's a quick rundown of the topics for tonight. We just established that design intent means that your game has values. We'll go over how to determine what your game's values are in the next section. After that, we'll talk about how you can best represent those values and talk far too briefly on what values should be shared. That being said, let's keep moving because this talk is going to be way longer than I ever anticipated it to. So if design intent is all about values, what are your game's values? What are some ways that designers determine what their values are and how they express those values to other people working on the project? We'll start with design pillars. I know that these have been covered here before, a lot in like JV's talks and other things, but they are worth bringing up again with a couple extra examples. I cannot stress to you how many designers I see talking about design pillars. If you go on like any design talk on the GDC Vault, somebody's going to mention at some point one of the pillars of the game, right? I would be willing to bet they will mention design pillars or the word tenets at some point in that conversation. Design pillars are a great way of constraining the mechanics and features of a game. They're usually short words or phrases that evoke the most important parts of your game. Things like combat. They also help build consensus around what your game is to a group of peers. It tells you what your game is going to be about or what your game's going to have in it. So when you think design pillars, think, what is my game? God of War, which the one that won all the Game of the Year awards last year, lays out a couple of its own pillars. This is all in a blog on the, like a blog post on the PlayStation blog, and I'll link it in references. God of War's pillars were the following three things: combat, exploration, and the relationship between a father and a son. Each of these pillars helps to define what the game is. If a feature or mechanic that what they wanted to add wasn't benefiting one of these pillars, then they would not add it. They even made this fancy little graphic for it. I don't know if this was before or after the blog post, but I think it's pretty neat. You can see that under some of these pillars, they rely on previous knowledge about the series in order to define what these pillars are, right? God of War, this wasn't the first one. So combat is a pillar that stands out as doing that quite a bit. There's a lot of technical things here, and the designer, like new mythical creatures, new mythical weapons, new mid-range and close, right? High optical mocap fidelity, right? There's a lot of really technical stuff, but that's because this is a part of the series that's been fleshed out a lot. And so there's a lot of design competency. The designers are relying on other people working on the title knowing kind of what this pillar is going to look like. This doesn't always work for indies. Whereas some other pillars are supported by more emotional and like less well-defined goals. Father-son stands out as one of those to me. Son will be believable, right? And symbiotic relationship. These still stick to some of the specificity that the design pillars require, but the designers are almost asking and answering themselves when they write this out. Like, how are we going to make father-son a pillar that stands out to the players? Well, we're going to humanize Kratos and give him a son that teaches him lessons. So that's it. That's the talk. No, it's not. Of course it's not. That would be silly. But like, you can sort of see how like a lot of designers stop at creating pillars. I know that I did until very, very recently. Because it's easy to look at this and say, okay, so for the next God of War, if those are our pillars, if this is what we're working with, we're going to go add a dolphin, right? New mythical creatures, a dolphin with a horn and wings. We're going to give it like a sword, like a fancy sword with a cool weapon trail. It's going to be Kratos' uncle, and we're going to make it believable, right? And that's going to go into the game, right? That makes sense, right? Because it's there in the pillars. But it doesn't make any sense. So in terms of values that your game has, pillars are going to give you the leftmost statement, right? Saying, we value blank, right? We value combat. We value exploration. But what do you slot into the rightmost section? If pillars are about defining what your game is, then anti-pillars are about defining what your game isn't. Before I get into this info, most of this section is like directly ripped from a Twitter thread that Jennifer Sherrill posted about 6 months ago. Jennifer is currently a lead game designer at ArenaNet, working on Guild Wars 2. And the thread covers a design talk that she had over lunch with Byron Miller, who just announced today, actually, that he's going to go work at Blizzard. So good for him. A link will be in my references, and I highly suggest you go read it yourself. In fact, like, just give her a follow, because that's, if you take nothing else away from tonight, like, you should follow her. And fun fact, if Guild Wars 2's wiki is correct, Byron Miller went to the U of R, which I thought was pretty neat. Pretty neat. So if you're watching this, Byron, hello, hi. So anti-pillars, caterpillars. Anti-pillars help you establish what your game isn't about, and more critically, why your game isn't about those things. Sherrill works with something called a design matrix, which we'll examine more in the next slide, in order to determine what her game's values are. The way that you create one of these matrices is by asking yourself a series of questions meant to test each of your design decisions and features. You want to use these questions to argue for your solutions and for your goals. Ideally, these questions are pretty precise and consider your values and pillars pretty directly. You can ask questions that are leaned against your design pillars, right? Meant to test those, like, are we helping to humanize Kratos with this feature? Or something asked from somebody else's perspective, right? Somebody external to your core team's perspective. Does this game about space exploration serve NASA's purpose and mission statement, right? These are ways to test what you're trying to put into the game. Sherrill and Miller propose a sort of hypothetical Souls-like game. I'll let that resonate for a sec. Hypothetical Souls-like game around the following pillar: compassion in a player community. If you know anything about Souls-like games, they do not place a lot of value on that. Also in this example, their hypothetical game allows certain players to make levels or bosses for other people to play with. On the leftmost column, and I know that it's not totally legible, so I'll read it aloud, is their question that they're asking, right? About any feature. Let's say it's just some feature in the game. Their question is, does this ultimately serve the player community synergy? The middle vector sort of expands on that question, clarifying any terms and making sure that that question can't be misinterpreted. Here they write that in their game, synergy happens between creators and players, where creators are able to extract reactions out of players, and players are able to communicate meaningfully with creators about their designs. In this example, that community synergy, right, which they're asking about, they're saying is fostered by communication between those creators and players, where designers can create better hardcore content when they have feedback from players. The rightmost vector is the why for all of that, saying that there's untapped potential in the market space for building a community that creates hardcore content based around the premise of helping one another succeed. So rather than going in and adding a dolphin to God of War, right? Maybe there's dolphins in God of War. I haven't played the whole thing, actually. A dolphin with lasers in God of War, right? We can ask the question, is that serving the player community synergy? If the answer is yes, then we know why. If the answer is no, then we know why and know that we should have that on the right side of our equation for what is one of our values. These takeaways are super important for design leadership because design leadership can't just say, well, this isn't supporting combat, right? They need to say, this is why it doesn't support the type of combat that we're going for. Dolphins with lasers are a great idea, I think. I think it's great. But it doesn't really pass the question, does this have a basis in Greek mythology, right? Because the Greeks didn't have death rays. Somebody clip that and send that to my employer. Oh my God. So here we're defining and embracing a value of our game, right? Here we value the consistency of the Greek mythos over a world in which that technology is more advanced, right? Over the more absurdist vision of that world, over an expanded worldview. We're saying we value the consistency that the Greek mythos has, and we know why. Sherrill says this practice mitigates having to play the bad guy, blocking features by being able to point and argue along the lines of those asked questions. And it helps build healthier teams, especially when those teams are new and in pre-production. Okay. So you've got your game's values. You understand a little bit better what your game's values are. They're sitting there. Your game's sitting there. And you're just going to hope that people pick up on them, right? Wrong. Here's a few ways that you can invite your player to learn about your game's values, engage with those values, and maybe, if you're lucky, reflect a bit on them. So learn, engage, and then reflect. We're talking about video games primarily. The player is a participant in any game and is a co-author in the experience that's created. Consider what are the ways that you're allowing your player to participate in your game's stated values, in combat over exploration or in NPC relationships over combat. What are the ways that you're allowing your player to participate in those stated values? Hopefully your players feel like they can participate in a few different ways. through their success in the game, through where they place their attention at any moment in an experience, and through your game's mechanics. We'll go over each of these. I want to stress before this next section that each of what I'm talking about in each section here is a tool that you can use to be able to help define your game's values and express your game's values. You do not need to do all of this, and like take or leave whatever you want in this next section, okay? Because this takes a long time if you really want to do them all. One of the most obvious ways to let your player participate is to let your player participate. I'm not just being like banal there. If your player can't play the game because they're dead or because they can't make any progress, then they can't engage with your game's values. So stop focusing on failure states for your player. Failure states mean that your player is being taught what your game is not about, or ways that they should not engage with your game. That means that they're not learning your values. They're learning everything that isn't your values, right? Think about all the different ways that your player can succeed, first and foremost. Go ahead and write out all the ways that that's going to happen. Like literally, like go down right through every single way that you think your player is going to succeed. At the beginning of your game, and especially in pre-production, that can be a really powerful tool. I'm going to give an example. So this was a game that I just helped to make like literally in the past 2 weeks because GDD2. It's a 2.5D platformer, and the main mechanic allows you a sentient blob to change between different physical forms. There's a rock, there's a slime, and then there's a balloon. The player is constantly moving to the right and needs to get to a flag at the end of the level, right? It's like GDD2 stuff. The rock allows you to also, shout out to my team, they're excellent, even with what I'm going to say. The rock allows you to slow down your momentum and fall really quickly. The slime allows you to fit through really tight spaces, and the balloon lets you gain some verticality and fly over certain obstacles. We agreed that we valued allowing the players to overcome obstacles in a number of ways, and agreed that we wanted to make the players form and materiality feel impactful at any moment during gameplay, throughout each level, no matter what form they were in. So when we first started designing the game, there was a tendency among the group to think of all the things that we could add to a level. Let's add spikes. That'll pop the balloon. Let's add water. That'll dissolve the slime, right? Let's add more hazards. Let's add a key pickup that's going to open a door later, right? It'll be some like meta task, like subtask for the player to achieve. The player needs to pick it up, or they'll have to like restart the level, right? All of these things are failure states. They stop the player from doing what's most interesting about our game, right? Which is using the materiality of this little slime to make it through different obstacles. And it stops you from utilizing your momentum in really like interesting ways. You're more worried about not dying than you are about really feeling good and engaging with what our values are. So let's instead focus on other parts of the game and on how we're helping our players to learn our values. Let's let players bounce with the slime so that they can propel themselves upwards, right, at different angles. Let's let the rock break down certain obstacles, have a little bit of destructibility so that the player can have some agency over the environment. Let's add little collectibles that'll guide the player through the level, but not force them through the level. Give them a sense of where to go. The shift doesn't drastically change the game or its values, but focusing on the successes of the player would allow us to put priority on what the player is doing correctly, rather than what the player is missing and not engaging with. By doing things this way, we're saying, here, player, we value your ability to make informed decisions about how to proceed over you rapidly failing in order to learn. We value your ability to change into any form over the forms like defined design spaces that we designers lay out, saying, no, you can't be a balloon here. You can't be a slime here. Take a sec. This one doesn't have any transitions. I want you to write out how you intend your player to experience your game at a really, really granular level. UI and UX designers probably have more to say about this than I do, and probably way more intelligent things to say about this than I do. But the idea is that in thinking about a player's experience, you are defining where your player is putting their attention. Your players are only going to pick up on your values if they're like being present in the places that you're putting those values, right? So you want to make sure that you're putting those values in places that your player's looking. One way that you can define your player's experience is with a player experience document, which we'll go into right now. Shout out to JV again, because I first heard about these from him. The player experience document is a way to define your player's flow, emotions, or actions through a game. You can write these in a lot of different ways, but I'll usually frame them something like the following. Again, I'm going to read this out. Slides will be released later. So, again, defining players' flow, emotions, or actions through a game. Step 1, the tree breaks, revealing a passage covered in sunlight. The player first notices a signpost in the distance with a navigation icon above it, and then notices that the path splits into 2 roads by that signpost. The player walks forward, eager to gain any knowledge that the signpost might be able to provide, and for any other objective that they can work towards. Suddenly, the player notices some alert icons in the bushes by the path to the right. The player halts their movement forward and waits cautiously to determine how they should approach this encounter. Enemies begin to come out of the bushes, which the player recognizes as low-level combatants. Confident in their abilities, the player begins to ready for combat by rushing forward, understanding that landing the first hit is important for them to be able to juggle enemies. Each of these bullet points helps to clearly define where the player's attention is, how the player feels about the stimulus that they're receiving, and gives an example of how the player might respond to that stimulus. Player experience documents are some of the most helpful tools that I use in order to lay out what a game is going to look like and how it's going to feel, especially in pre-production. If you're interested in more reading on this, I really would give some like RPG adventures a read, because they like words and descriptions are all that they have in order to set players up for success. I think they do a pretty good job of it. So success, experience. Now I want you to think about the participant player in terms of mechanics. Consider all the ways you're allowing your player to engage with the game's values mechanically. Every action that the player takes should reinforce those values. Let's consider an example, okay? I wish I had a better reference for this, but theater of the mind, okay? An example, let's say that there's a fence that blocks the player's progression through a level. Let's say that this fence is stuck between 2 walls and that the player needs to get to the other side. It's just a wooden fence. The way that you explore and proceed here, right, can say a lot that you can let the player explore and proceed here, says a lot about your game's values. What are the different ways that you're allowing your player to get over to the other side of that fence? Are you letting the player hop over the fence? Are you letting them break through the fence? Can they slide under the fence? Can you climb up the walls beside the fence? Can they pick up the fence and move it somewhere else? Can they convince the fence that it ought to get out of your way? Each of these different mechanics is an expression of your game's values. Do you value aggression in your game? Okay, great. Let your player charge right through that fence. Do you value player experimentation in exploration? Let them hop over the fence, slide under the fence, or climb those walls beside the fence. Do you value player construction and a sense of agency over their environment? Let them pick it up and move it somewhere else. These values aren't mutually exclusive. But you can see that even in a potentially banal interaction with a fence, that we're able to express our game's values. I'm behind. Doing more than one of these things also expands the ways that your player can choose to interact with your game, which is huge when you want them to feel like they can participate. You're giving them options for saying, hey, I understand what your game's values are a little bit. Let me try something out. If you want more reading on this in particular, I highly, I'm hitting the TV. I'm so excited about it. Checking out some of Avery Alder's work on queer mechanics and pretty much anything else that she's worked on. She's a queer game designer based out of Canada, and she focuses a lot on subverting traditional mechanics intentionally. Also a great follow on Twitter. References. This is like her wheelhouse. Okay. Take a deep breath. That's a lot. John, that's so much. Please help. Again, it's not of the utmost importance that you do every single one of these things. These are tools that you can use to help define the user's experience and think about how your values are being portrayed. Even if you do just one of these things the next time that you're in pre-production for a game, it's going to help you get more comfortable with being intentional with your design and being intentional about your values and expressing those values. Really, I'm ignoring my clicker notes. But so takeaways, as we just said with the fence example, are happening at every single level of a game's design. Between those moments of success, responses to player stimulus, and mechanics that express your game's values, players are engaging all the time. And it happens at the high level, like, this is what the game's about, right? Like, this game is about, I don't know, like combat, right? But it also happens at a really granular level, right? This is what this moment in this game is about. I'll explain myself a little bit. So let's talk about Overwatch. I'm sure most of us are familiar, and I'm just going to run with the idea that we are familiar. We know that this game is going to have a set of values that it's trying to express. So what's an example of a way in which Overwatch expresses its values? So when I, John Blau, think about Overwatch, I think about the line, "The world needs more heroes." A lot of the marketing campaign revolves around like being a hero and joining Overwatch, right? So I'm immediately presented with the idea that in Overwatch, I'm going to be a hero. This is probably one of their pillars. I don't know for sure, but feeling like a hero is probably one of their pillars. How does Overwatch make me feel like a hero on a granular level? Well, they have really objective-focused gameplay, right? Once you've accomplished this thing, you've succeeded. They have unique abilities for each character to give them identity and let them stand out from other individuals in the world, right? It gives them a real sense of having character. It also has like hit confirmations and like a heightened awareness of the battlefield, so much so that it almost feels like you have certain like superhuman abilities to understand your surroundings, right? Well, icons above the player's head, you hear shout-outs from both sides of the team, both teams. All sorts of other ways, and I could go on. That could be a whole nother talk, and it probably is. But I'm not running around the corners of Overwatch saying like, all right, there's a Reaper in front of me. Gosh, the world really does need more heroes, doesn't it? You know? It's not like an active thing. I'm not thinking that every moment. So let's think about like how the intent of the designers played into this particular situation. In Overwatch, you have these things called escort missions. They're basically payload missions where you have to take one moving object, usually like a car, through a predetermined path and help it reach a final destination. I call it payload because I used to play like 1,000 hours of TF2. Most of those are on Medic. I don't know why I went there. But they're escort missions in Overwatch. And they, like the maps that it has, can sometimes present some seemingly really different values. What's going on? So we have two different levels that we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about Dorado, and then we're going to talk about Junkertown. Both of these missions have the exact same mechanics, or pretty close to the exact same mechanics. The same heroes can be used on them. They have similar power-ups. The mission plays out in a way that we'd expect an escort mission to play out. But the context of these missions changes like a lot of our perception. The game's values vary drastically if somebody's only familiar, right? If somebody only plays one of these maps, they can walk away from Overwatch feeling very different. Here's why. So in Dorado, Dorado, just for some context, is a city currently celebrating a day of importance. Right? You can see the streets are lined with all sorts of celebratory architecture, festival stuff. And Junkertown is a city made of like cobbled together garbage, kind of in the middle of nowhere, Australia, run by a scrappy bunch of individuals, mostly with low income. In Dorado, your mission is to escort a power generator to a clean energy facility in a country that was not long ago war-torn. You escort this generator on a day of national importance to the country and are really rooted in their culture as you move through it. To these people, your actions are a fulfillment of a commitment to peace and to a brighter future. In Dorado, the attackers are heroes. Overwatch, be a hero. But in Junkertown, your mission is to pile a cart high with stolen money and explosives, drive that cart into your old home, take revenge against the people who doubted you by blowing up the cart in the middle of a civilian population. In Junkertown, the attackers are more than not heroes. They're kind of terrorists. They are terrorists. The world needs more heroes, right? Okay, so that probably just barred me from any Activision job in the future. No, I'm kidding. I'm going to save myself here. So there's clearly some competing values here, right? The designers are making intentional choices about those competing values. What are the values? I think that it's the following. The designers are saying, we value making players feel like they're heroes over the players actually being heroes. And actually, with Overwatch, that makes a lot of sense. You can play as villains in Overwatch. You're not always a good person. You can play attack or defense on some of these maps. And there's some dissonance there, right? But the designers are making a very conscious choice about saying, we want the players to feel like they're heroes more than we want the players to actually be heroes. My point isn't to say that Overwatch should have made a different decision in this circumstance, since there's a lot more nuance to how Overwatch presents its values and a lot other avenues through which Overwatch presents its values. It's just to show that designers were intentionally placing one set of values over another, and how the player's perception can be really skewed by that. They're really clear about this dichotomy and made their game's values of feeling like a hero and acting in heroic ways clear enough that not a lot of people walk away after playing Junkertown saying, well, I don't feel quite great about that, right? They present that first value in such a strong and firm way through all the hit confirmations, through all of the characteristics of each of the characters, right? That you don't feel like that. What if somebody does, right? What if somebody says, I don't really feel good about having played through Junkertown? What if your intent is not actually the player's experience? And the values you want to portray aren't the ones that are being engaged with. At least right now in my life, I really think that you should listen to your players. What your players perceive your values to be are much more important than what your values actually are. So if you think that your game is about combat, but somebody tells you that your game is about apple picking and kicking around leaves, I don't know, crazy, wild example, listen to them. Especially as independent developers, we have the leverage to change course and dictate the scope and vision for a game in so many more ways than people working in AAA. If that doesn't make sense to you, then ignore that advice. Make the product that you want to make, right? Go out and redefine your game in terms of the values that you want. That doesn't stop those values being the ones that your player is currently walking away with. This, of course, is going to vary a lot based on who your stakeholders are. And the impression of what those values of a game should be portraying are going to be defined a lot by who those stakeholders are. In general, you should listen to what your players say is engaging about the game and go from there. It's important to remember that other members of your team might not agree. A designer's role is also to build consensus about the game, about what your values are, what the vision is. You won't always have complete control and flexibility to be able to change these things. Okay, we're almost done. Y'all are doing great. I appreciate you. Mwah. Love you too, bud. Okay, so we're almost done. The next section, okay, could be and is the topic of probably another 14 talks. 14 plus, 1,400 talks. I'm not the person who should be giving these talks. So I'll link a bunch in the references, and I also am not going to do this enough justice. Okay, so we talked about the fact that your game has values. We talked about some strategies for figuring out what those values are. We talked about how to best represent those values. We did not talk about, well, what are your values, right? Like, are they values that are moral? Should they reasonably be shared? Everything that you add, take away, or omit from a game has consequences. You, as the designer, should assume some level of responsibility for the things that you don't intend your game to say. Think really critically about advocacy, representation, cultural appropriation, and people living in countries other than the US when you make your games. Your games are political. Embrace it. It's a strength. Also, while I have the stage, I think that we can do way better than creating games with guns about shooting other people. Think bigger than that, because we totally have to. So in the talk, because it's certainly been long enough, we covered design intent means actively questioning how your game expresses its values. We talked about some ways to define your values through pillars and anti-pillars. We talked about ways to represent your game's values to the player by encouraging their success, focusing their experience, and by making meaningful mechanics. We talked about the fact that your game is saying something and that games can be a powerful force for expressing those values. Be good and intentional about what values you're expressing and how you express them. That's all I've got for you tonight. I really appreciate everybody coming out to hear the talk. I value you all being here more than I value you being anywhere else, really. So thank you. Also, huge thanks to these people, John Veneron, Elizabeth, Sam Camarada, Noah Ratcliffe, Sarah Gouveia, Jennifer Sherrill, Avery Alder, and all the other people that I reference. We'll go off stream and move to a Q&A. Thanks.
We're going to do the Q&A on stream.
On stream? Oh, shoot. We're going to do it on stream. We're doing it live. Hello, stream. I haven't formally addressed you yet. If you've made it this far, I also love you, like I love the person in the back row of the audience. Shoot. So.
What if you feel like your game has two core values that contradict each other?
Okay. So the question is, what if your game has two core values that contradict each other? A lot of pre-production is making sure that that's not the case. And ensuring that, like, a designer's role is making sure that there's consensus about what the game's going to be. If there are moments that are confusing like that, then a designer should really step in, or producer, anybody else on the team should step in and say, hey, I'm not fully understanding what we're going for here, right? If you've done the pillars, if you've done the anti-pillars, if you've done all that other work, it'll help you to flesh out and not have those moments. But if you end up in that situation, I'm going to say again, listen to your players. If your players are playing your game and you have two conflicting things, let's say like combat and then also like trying to respect the environment. Let's say you can chop down a tree, but also like your game is trying to say like you shouldn't chop down trees. Wild example, right? And your players say, well, as I'm playing this game, I don't want to chop, like, I don't feel like I should be chopping down these trees, right? I want to go like touch the tree. I want to pick an apple from the tree. I don't want to chop it down. Then listen to your players. That's my personal take. Because your players are telling you, like, this is interesting about your game, right? This is the interesting moment. This is what I think your game's values are. That's a strength. That's something you have built in. Whether you realized it or not, that's a strength that you have built in, so listen to that. Answer your question? What's up?
To kind of build off of that last question, one of the games that I've been making, I made in a game jam a bit ago, and I'm planning on continuing on making, kind of has contradicting design, but I think that it also like works together in the sense that it's supposed to be a strategy game. You're supposed to think about things. You're supposed to figure things out, but by definition, all of the things that you have, all the things you use to figure things out are limited, and the only thing that is unlimited is a thing that's not for sure.
Sure.
It's kind of trying to build on, trying to figure things out for sure, but not being able to, so it's trying to build on uncertainty, trying to build on trepidation, trying to be an anxious experience where players are supposed to strategize. And so, like, in that sense, I mean, at that point, I don't know if it really count as contradicting, but like, it still feels like those two things contradict. Like, you want to be sure of things, but you also cannot be.
Sure. So it sounds like, and I'll repeat some of that. So it sounds like what you're saying is that you have, at the core of your game is a feeling of like uncertainty and not like committing to one of two different value sets that you're representing. Does that sound about right?
Yeah.
So I think that I would like step back and try to redefine maybe like what the value is that I'm trying to present. Is the value that option A or option B, right? Like red pill, blue pill? Or is the value that I'm creating in that uncertainty, right? Saying, I want to fixate on the uncertainty that those two things create and allow the player to experience that more deeply, right? It doesn't mean that you need to commit to one or the other to give a fair representation of both of those things. It just means, like, I would sort of like reframe it as like, I value the uncertainty that these two things create.
When I was making it, like, I am leaning into the uncertainty. It's just that I also, like, the other quote-unquote pillars were kind of based on that other pillar, so I guess they're like pillars of the pillar.
Yeah. That can be a really tough moment. I'm happy to talk about that more afterwards if you're around. What you got?
So where does kind of like scope intersect with your pillars and your questions? Like, when do you have too many pillars, or when do you have too many questions or morals? Then how do you feel like that you can evaluate that?
Really good question. So the question is, how does scope intersect with these pillars and these values that you're laying out? I'm going to be 100% honest with you and say that I don't have the most design experience. Whoa. I don't have like the most design experience, so I can't speak from a point of professionalism here. What I'd say is sort of like two things. Scope is something to be aware of, but I don't know that as a designer, I want that to be at the forefront of my mind. I find scope to be a limiting thing. It stops me as a designer from saying yes and. And as a designer, I want to be able to say yes and as much as I can. I want to be able to think like in radical ways about how this game could be done, right? I want to think a lot further than like what I understand can be done within the certain scope of what we're trying to do. So while it's an important consideration and something that like maybe is one of those questions that you ask in a design matrix, right? Like, can this be done like during I don't know that I would make that a question, but like maybe find a way to ask that question about scope in one of the design matrices and bounce your features off of that. Because I think that that's a constraint as opposed to something that like is actively going to enhance your game's values. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question? Thank you. Sup, Sam?
So I know you will be like looking at your slides, and that your slides have resources that I've a lot of what you talked about tonight. But in terms of if I'm watching this talk or if I'm listening to you and thinking like I don't feel right now like I'm a game designer, but I want to get started. Like, what advice would you give someone kind of heading down the path because this is really interesting, but I don't know where to start?
Great. So if you listen to this talk and are like, oh shit, and I've made you feel bad, firstly, I'm sorry. But secondly, if you are working in games, you are a game designer. It took me a long while to convince myself of that. If you are working in games, you're a game designer. Because at whatever level that you're operating at, you have some control over how that game is perceived. You have some control over the values that your players are going to experience, right? If you're an animator, right, and you don't make something quite as snappy as like maybe your value would want it to be, then your player's going to feel that. So I would say that firstly, you are a game designer. And secondly, I would say that this is something that like design intent and all these things up here are good. Like the pillars thing is a good tool to start thinking about it. The matrix is a little bit more advanced maybe, but like thinking about ways that your player is going to succeed, and that player experience document, literally running through and writing out like this is what I want the player to do at every single moment, can be a really empowering thing for young designers because it's literally just you going through and saying this is what I want to be done. So you are a game designer, no matter what level you're at. And these are just some ways to be a little bit more thoughtful and intentional about that game's design. There's nothing from chat. I would love to answer some of these questions, and I would love to keep that conversation going. Come up to the front, and we'll talk about those. I just want to make sure that the VOD doesn't go too long. Yes, come on up here. Thank you so much.
One more round of applause for John, because that was So thank you very much, John Blau, for a wonderful talk. These slides will be made available after the talk, not quite sure where, website, social media. You can keep your eye on the Roc Game Dev Discord and social media accounts if you want to keep track of these slides. Thank you for streaming, and those will be archived as well if you want to reference the talk later. Those will be on our YouTube channel, correct? Mm-hmm. Okay. Awesome. Thank you so much again, everyone. Please take more pizza and beverages, but don't take the cardboard. That's for Mark. All right. Good night, everyone. Oh.
If you, okay, just super quick to end. You have intent, right? Regardless of whether you think you do or not. So you're a game designer. That's all.
John Blau, everyone.